I knew I was officially irrelevant the second I walked into the Monday meeting and saw a vision board titled Logistics, but make it sexy. Chad was up front, hair slicked back like a wet otter, teeth bleached beyond OSHA safety limits, pitching synergy waves and digitized momentum cycles to a room full of exhausted logistics veterans who still balanced invoices with calculators older than their grandkids. 14 years. 14 goddamn years I gave that company. I'd kept our vendor chain together during a pandemic, talked a union rep out of filing federal complaints, and once caught a seven-figure misallocation because a single digit looked off. But sure, bring in the founder's son with his Wharton certificate and jawline like a poorly drawn triangle and call him the visionary. I was still holding my styrofoam cup of burnt breakroom coffee when Henry, the founder, a man who once called me the company's immune system, stood up and clapped like he was introducing Elon Musk's mediocre cousin. Everyone, this is Chad. He'll be joining as co-strategist, like we were a chessboard and he was the knight riding in to save us all from financial stability. Claire, Henry added, not even making eye contact, help him adjust. He'll need your institutional knowledge. Right, institutional knowledge. That's code for do all the hard parts. But don't talk too loud while doing them or someone might mistake you for important. Now before I go on, let me just say something real quick. 97% of y'all listening to this haven't hit subscribe yet. I know, commitment's scary. But hey, it keeps the lights on, and it reminds the team that someone out there's rooting for women like Claire, quietly holding the world together while some jackass named Chad plays CEO cosplay. So if you like these kinds of stories, hit that button. All right, back to the carnage. Chad spent his first week firing 3 perfectly competent operations leads and replacing them with his fantasy football buddies from undergrad. One of them asked me what a ledger was. Another renamed our Slack channels into crap like #hustle harder and #big brain moves. The third kept trying to schedule team yoga in the warehouse mezzanine. Real forward thinkers. And yet I smiled. I nodded. I added commas to their sloppy invoices and triple-checked their vendor codes behind the scenes so we wouldn't accidentally wire $400K to a TikTok influencer by mistake. Yes, that almost happened, don't ask. I got used to the new hierarchy fast. My office, once right beside Henry's, was now next to the IT server closet, which conveniently doubled as a sauna in July. My direct reports? Reassigned to Chad's Ops Vibe team, which was a real name on a real org chart. I ate lunch alone, again, but I didn't quit, not because I was afraid. Hell, I'd been poached before, big firms, better salaries. I stayed because I knew things, knew where the ghosts were buried in the ledgers, knew which contracts were bound by handshake and which ones had kill switches. And I knew that Chad had missed something. It started with a contract renewal. Small freight supplier based in Pittsburgh, nothing flashy, but I saw my signature on the escrow clause, just mine and Henry's. No Chad, no ops vibe, just the old school in me. And it hit me like a freight train made of karma. He doesn't even know this exists. I read that clause 3 times. Dual signature escrow. Funds couldn't move without both me and Henry signing off. I'd structured it that way back in 2016, when the supplier had a hiccup in compliance and I wanted a failsafe. No one had asked me to. I just did it. And now? That little clause was a loaded gun with Chad's name on the bullet. See, the money in that escrow account was small compared to our total revenue, but strategically it was everything. That supplier handled our cold chain logistics. You lose that and the whole perishable side of the business goes belly up in 3 days flat. But Chad, he was too busy pitching NFT-powered delivery models and trying to get us verified on threads. So I sat there, quiet, watching, waiting, pretending I didn't notice that he kept forgetting to include me in strategy emails, that he scheduled meetings over my calendar blocks, that he introduced himself as the head of ops while I typed the real numbers into QuickBooks under a login-marked accounting bot. Controlled resignation. That's what I called it, like watching your house get painted puke green but knowing the foundation's still yours. You don't scream, you wait. You wait until the storm's dumb enough to think you're asleep. And me? I wasn't asleep. I was sharpening every line in that contract like a blade, because someday soon, that boy was going to lean on the wrong fund and find out it wasn't his to move. Chad's first official act as co-strategist was to fire Rosalie, our 63-year-old invoice controller, who could spot a fraudulent vendor faster than a junkyard dog sniffing out copper wiring. Said she was non-digital forward and lacked adaptive velocity. She cried in the break room next to the vending machine that still ate your quarters. And when I asked him why he hadn't consulted anyone before doing it, Chad sipped his green sludge smoothie and said, "Claire, disruption requires discomfort." The next day, he hired his roommate from undergrad, Kellen, a man who once asked if invoices were that thing with barcodes, like for Amazon. Kellen's credentials included a failed crypto podcast and a minor in media synergy. Chad gave him a VP title and a standing desk that cost more than Rosalie's annual dental. The office changed fast. Familiar faces vanished. New ones swaggered in, all cologne and jargon, holding brainstorm huddles in the copy room and whiteboarding phrases like brand logistics empowerment. Chad turned the lunchroom into a collaboration hub with beanbags. No one asked for beanbags. The team wanted pay raises. They got kombucha on tap. I stayed quiet. I stayed busy. I stayed underestimated. I started forwarding every major decision to my personal email, BCC, timestamped archived, just in case, and then came the first real rupture. We had a sensitive supplier in Nebraska, handled time-critical materials for one of our biggest pharma clients. Their invoices required a rolling net 10 structure, tied to specific fulfillment milestones. It was delicate if you paid too early. It triggered insurance flags. Too late and they froze transport. Chad, in all his Red Bull brilliance, decided we'd pay them up front and in bulk to build rapport and lean into trust models. I laid out the risks in plain English, showed him charts, walked him through the penalties. He blinked at me like I'd spoken Aramaic and said, "Claire, we're not a risk-averse brand. We're a bold playmaker now." I knew right then that we were headed for impact, but instead of fighting it out in front of his entourage, who all wore matching quarter zips with Team Chad embroidered on the sleeve, I said, "Sure thing. Bold is good," and copied the modified payment terms to my cloud folder marked when it all burns. By Friday, the supplier emailed their discomfort. Monday, they followed up with legalese. Tuesday, Chad replied to them with a gif of Tom Cruise saying, "Let's fly, baby." I kid you not. A gif. That week I started locking my drawers again. Something I hadn't done in a decade. The new hires treated me like a sad office relic. "Oh, Claire, you're so vintage. You actually print your reports," one of them said, laughing like a drunk seal. Another asked if I needed help opening a Google Doc. I told her I'd used Excel before she was born, and if she kept talking, I'd pivot table her social calendar into next fiscal year. I kept the sarcasm tight, sharp, wrapped in sugar. But inside, my rage was blooming like mold under a tarp. I'd spent over a decade insulating this place from its own stupidity, and now I was watching a frat house in Slack's play CEO while my work got attributed to team dynamics. I was being erased, slowly. My name vanished from invite lists. My reporting line got flattened in a restructuring that somehow left Chad reporting to himself. At one point, I had to ask Kellen, a man who once stapled his tie to a tax form, for access to a budget folder I created. Still, I said nothing. Instead, I started taking walks, watching, listening. Every time Chad pushed me aside, he showed me what he didn't know. And that ignorance, it was stacking up like dynamite in a storage shed. The supplier drama escalated, of course. They threatened to pause services. Chad tried to negotiate with TikTok videos and LinkedIn quotes. I watched the fire rise with the quiet detachment of someone holding the sprinkler system's kill switch. He thought I was done. He thought I was just one HR offboarding meeting away from vanishing. But what he didn't know was that I still held the one thread he couldn't see. That escrow, that clause, that locked fund with a quiet little clause that said, signatures, Claire Halstead and Henry Blakemore, jointly required. And I wasn't going anywhere. Not until the whole thing came crashing down. Henry called it a quick catch-up, but his tone had that familiar paternal tilt, the kind men like him use when they're about to say something disappointing and want it to sound like a favor. He'd booked the executive conference room, the one with the two slick chairs and the taxidermy moose head that always looked like it disapproved of your KPIs. I walked in holding a folder of flagged vendor inconsistencies. He gestured toward the leather chair like we were equals. "Claire," he began, "I know things feel different lately, different, like calling stage 4 cancer a tricky cough." He smiled like he hadn't just let a human PowerPoint presentation dismantle half my department. "I want you to know I still trust you. I do, I always have. But Chad, he's got to stretch his wings. Learn the ropes, you understand, right?" Ah, there it was, the real reason. He wasn't trying to save me, he was preemptively soothing his own guilt. "He's got ideas," Henry continued. "Some'll land, some won't, but we've got to let the boy make mistakes." The boy. Henry was talking like Chad was 7 and playing with Legos, not hemorrhaging vendor relations and tanking fulfillment KPIs in real time. I stared at Henry's weathered face, lines carved by decades of risk and profit. He used to rule this company like a cranky god. Now he looked tired, like maybe even he wasn't sure this legacy was worth handing down. "What if his mistakes don't bounce back?" I asked, soft but pointed. "What if they take the roof off?" He looked away. "Then we fix the roof, that's what we've always done." I wanted to scream. Instead, I nodded, said of course, and walked out of that room with a migraine blooming behind my eyes like an airbag. I went back to my office, not the one I used to have with windows, but the one by the HVAC humming like a dying walrus, and sat in silence. I thought about quitting, not just in the "I deserve better" way, but in the real way. The zip a folder, draft a resignation, pour a glass of Cabernet way. What was I staying for? The pension? The pride? Then it landed on my desk. A renewal packet from Cold Trail Freight, the same Nebraska supplier Chad had fumbled. Legal had routed it to me as always. It was thick, stamped, final stage draft. Right there on page 14, escrow retention agreement clause. The language was almost identical to the one I wrote in 2016, except it still had the same release condition. Joint authorization, Claire Halstead and Henry Blakemore. No Chad, no updated routing, no changes, probably because nobody had even noticed. Chad didn't read past the executive summary on anything longer than a meme. I sat frozen, coffee going cold. That clause meant the funds, $2.4 million in conditional supplier payments, were still locked behind my approval. Without my signature, the payout didn't move. And with the new quarterly burn rate Chad had cooked up, that fund wasn't just a payment, it was leverage. I checked the server logs. No update since 2019. No access requests, no legal modifications. They'd forgotten it existed. I hadn't. Suddenly, quitting felt like giving away the detonator to the idiot holding the dynamite. And I wasn't feeling charitable. So instead of resigning, I did what any overlooked woman in finance should do when surrounded by frat boys with god complexes. I made a folder. Labeled it Moss, contingency, password protected, cloud mirrored. Filled it with vendor correspondence, payment timelines, performance flags, and an annotated copy of the escrow agreement with my initials on every page. Then I went home, poured that wine, put on Coltrane, and smiled for the first time in weeks. Because Henry might have handed his company to a golden boy in shiny shoes, but he'd also handed me the safety pin holding the grenade. And one day soon, I was going to pull it. It was a Tuesday, always is somehow. The kind of Tuesday that starts with your name missing from a calendar invite and ends with a little piece of your dignity being fed through a paper shredder. Chad was leading a strategy sync in the main conference room, big glass walls, free croissants, the works. I wasn't supposed to be there. My name wasn't on the list. But the finance team had questions about Q2 burn rate, and the project manager dragged me in because Claire's the only one who actually knows where the numbers come from. I walked in with my notepad and 3 sticky tabs marked critical, don't ignore, and Chad's latest screw up. The room smelled like cheap cologne and blueberry candle. Chad was already mid-ramble, pacing like a text dropout, dropping words like agile funneling and influencer-grade fulfillment visibility. When he saw me, he smiled the way you'd smile at a squirrel that wandered into a courtroom. Claire, great you're here. We were just talking about your department. My department, right? The one he'd gutted and Frankensteined into the Capital Experience pod. Mind if I clarify something on the vendor ledger inconsistencies? I asked, holding up the spreadsheet that had actual math on it. Real figures, money, reality. But Chad didn't look at it. Didn't even glance. Instead, he turned to the room, his circle of yes men and LinkedIn larvae, and said, see, this is the kind of static thinking that holds companies back. Claire's incredible in the past, but we need flexible minds now, not ones stuck in old cycles. No offense, Claire, but your vibe is a little stale. Stale. He said it with that same smirk he wore when renaming the customer service desk to the Delight Squad. Like this was all a joke. Like I wasn't the reason this company still had cash flow after his last genius idea torched our Q1 forecast. I didn't say a word. I just closed my notebook, nodded, and sat down. Not out of submission, out of calculation. You never interrupt a fool mid-monologue, you just let them keep handing you ammunition. Then came the kill shot. Chad spun to his laptop and clicked over to a slide titled Brand Realignment Strategy. And there, under new leadership vision, was a name I'd never seen. Brittany S., brand advisor. I blinked. Who's Brittany? Oh, Chad said casually, she's our new branding touchpoint. She ran a viral slime account on Instagram and has like huge cultural instincts. We needed someone who really gets tone. Brittany, with 2 T's and an E, who once posted a TikTok tutorial on how to frost cupcakes with a hairdryer. She'd be collaborating with finance to create vibing invoices and aesthetic transaction flows. That was the moment something in me stopped bending. I didn't break. I didn't scream. I just felt a click somewhere deep, quiet, and final, like a gear slipping into its last irreversible rotation. That night, I logged in remotely, pulled up the escrow clause, reread it, still intact, still mine and Henry's. Then I opened a secondary clause I'd added years ago, fail-safe for delayed releases due to vendor compliance shifts. With a few keystrokes, I updated the contingency trigger to include a verification audit clause. Any major shift in supplier terms required a full review by originating signatories before escrow could be considered for release. In plain English, I just legally buried that money in concrete. Unless both Henry and I lifted the clause together and verified every single change Chad had made, funds wouldn't move a penny. And knowing Chad, he hadn't even read the original contract, let alone tracked his own chaos. I saved the update, printed a hard copy, stored it in a lockbox under my sink next to my expired passport and a small fortune in sticky notes that could bring half this company to its knees. Then I started assembling my exit plan, not the 2 weeks notice type. The kind where you leave behind a vacuum so precise, so undeniably essential, it chokes the oxygen out of whoever tried to replace you. I contacted an estate lawyer I trusted, asked about contract holdings and legal indemnity clauses in case of separation. He didn't ask questions, just nodded and said, smart. I started clocking patterns. Who Chad trusted, who was scared, Who was watching him the way I was? I backed up every finance model I'd ever touched to a personal drive labeled Archives Do Not Delete and stored it off network. I compiled a folder of irregularities in supplier payments, nothing explosive yet but patterns. The kind of patterns you only notice when you've balanced the same damn books for 14 years. Smoldering rage is quiet. It doesn't throw staplers. It makes spreadsheets. It writes memos in polite fonts. It smiles when replaced by Brittany, the brand influencer. And it waits, because I wasn't going to leave like a disgruntled old-timer fading into HR oblivion. I was going to walk out holding the one thread still tethering the company's lungs to its heart. And when I pulled it, I'd make sure everyone felt the snap. It started with a knock on my door, a soft one. Like someone asking permission to trespass in a room they technically had clearance to enter, but emotionally understood was holy ground. "Claire," came a hesitant voice. "Do you have a sec?" It was May, junior compliance analyst. Sharp, skittish, always 3 cups of coffee deep and one existential crisis away from crying in the stairwell. She hovered in my doorway like a raccoon sensing a trap. I looked up from my spreadsheet and raised an eyebrow. "You lost, sweetheart?" HR's 2 doors down. She laughed, nervously, clutched a manila folder like it was a cursed object. "No, I was doing an audit of sign-off chains for last quarter's vendor approvals and something's off." I leaned back, motioned her in. She stepped lightly like she thought Chad had planted landmines in the carpet. She handed over the folder. Inside were 6 vendor authorization forms, each missing proper timestamp logs, several with duplicate digital initials, and one with an outright forgery. Chad's name slapped over approvals that were supposed to go through legal. 2 were dated on weekends the system didn't even allow edits. "Where'd you find these?" I asked, voice calm but skin buzzing like I'd just touched a downed wire. They were nested in an old sandbox folder marked Q1 Stratmock. He must have uploaded the final versions without removing the fakes. I looked at her. Pale. Young. Wearing a cardigan with dancing lobsters on it. "Does anyone else know?" She shook her head fast. "No, I wasn't sure what to do. Technically they're violations, but if I flag them it'll get routed through Chad and he'll bury it." I finished for her. She nodded, eyes wide. I saw in her what I used to feel in myself, that gut-deep knowledge that doing the right thing might cost you everything. I closed the folder. May listened carefully. "You didn't see these with me. You're going to take a sick day tomorrow. You'll back these up on a personal flash drive. Store the originals off network, and then pretend you found nothing." Her face went white. "But shouldn't we tell Henry or legal?" "We will," I said gently, "but not yet. You're not the messenger for this. You're the insurance policy." I copied the files to a drive of my own. A red-labeled one I kept inside a hollowed-out copy of financial statements and forensic flags. Then I scanned each form, annotated the inconsistencies, and printed 3 hard copies. One went into my home safe, one into a locked file under my desk, and one I sealed in an envelope labeled "If found, delivered to legal counsel confidential." Then I sent a text to my contract lawyer. "Need to meet, topic, personal estate planning." He texted back in 5 seconds. "Coffee or bourbon?" "Both." We met the next day, downtown. Quiet corner booth of a dying steakhouse that still smelled like 1992. I brought 2 folders, a flash drive, a burner email address. He brought a legal pad and a necktie that looked like it hadn't seen daylight since Lehman Brothers collapsed. "Hypothetically," I began, "if someone had knowledge of forged internal approvals that impacted escrow-bound transactions." He held up a hand. "You're consulting me about your estate." I nodded. "Right, and in the event of my hypothetical departure, I'd want to ensure certain contracts, signatory rights, and fiduciary records were protected." He scribbled, "How hostile is the environment?" I took a sip of coffee. "Let's say there's a social media intern 1 Slack message away from running our treasury." He winced. "Got it. Red folder protocol?" I nodded again. He handed me a document template. "This gives you retroactive indemnity coverage and file ownership transfer in the event of separation, voluntary or otherwise." "Good," I said. "Also need a clause limiting any post-departure audit of my work to authorized compliance officers only." "That'll raise flags. Only if they try to open the drawer." By the time I walked out, I had a binder of safeguards and a thumb drive backed up 3 ways. If Chad came at me with an axe, I had the schematics for his whole damn lumber mill. Back at the office, I saw May sitting alone in the break room, staring into a cold cup of tea. I dropped a post-it on the table with one line: "Don't be the hero, be the survivor." She looked up. I nodded once, then walked away. I wasn't building a bomb. I was building the fuse, and I was almost ready to light it. The conference room smelled like citrus toner and delusion. Chad had requested a Q3 Momentum Summit, which was basically an excuse to project his self-worth onto a 70-inch LED screen, while his inner circle nodded like dashboard bobbleheads. There were bagels, of course. There were always bagels when Chad wanted to ruin something. But this time they were gluten-free and shaped like dollar signs, Kellen's idea. "Brand symbolism," he'd whispered, as if that explained why our quarterly financial review now had a DJ-curated playlist and mood lighting. I sat at the far end of the table, right next to the potted ficus that had been dying since 2017. My laptop was open, spreadsheet loaded, fingers poised. heart thudding slow and hot, because I knew this was it. This was the switch flip meeting, the one where Chad pushed just hard enough to knock the whole teetering mess into collapse. He took the floor with the swagger of a man who'd mistaken luck for talent. "Here's the play," he said, clicking to a slide titled Supplier Reallocation and Growth Funnel Explosion. "We're going to redirect $2.4 million from legacy vendor holding accounts into brand reach. Targeted influencer campaigns, logistics as a lifestyle content, viral freight." Viral freight. I blinked, slowly, like a lizard trying not to die. He was talking about pulling from the escrow. My escrow. Cold trail fund that was locked under a clause so airtight it practically had a retina scan. Money earmarked for supplier continuity, vendor assurance, shipment guarantees during global disruptions, and he wanted to use it to film TikToks with truckers doing the doogie. "We've already onboarded an agency," Chad continued, showing a mock-up of a billboard featuring a shirtless man hugging a package of insulin. "Shipping saves lives." Emotionally evocative. Silence fell like an aneurysm. I cleared my throat. That escrow's restricted by dual signature clause. Redirecting those funds could breach contractual obligations and activate hold clauses in our Tier 2 supplier network. Chad didn't even look at me, just grinned. "Yeah, I figured you'd say that. Already spoke to legal. They're cool if you're cool. So be cool." Then he walked over to my chair, and leaned down so close I could smell the charcoal toothpaste he thought masked incompetence. "Move the money, Claire." Every eye in the room shifted, half confused, half relieved it wasn't them. I clicked my pen twice, a habit that meant one thing in my brain: remember this moment, it's the final domino. "All right," I said. "I'll initiate a partial transfer today." He clapped like he'd taught a parrot to curse. "Knew you'd come around," but I wasn't coming around. I was closing the door behind him and sealing the edges with legal concrete. I left the meeting without touching the bagels, went straight to my office, locked the door, and pulled up the cold trail payment interface. First, I logged a partial routing request for $400K, non-escrow, just enough to make it look like progress. Then I opened the escrow terminal. Dual key authorization window popped up, still showing Henry's initials from 2019, mine beside it. And then, very carefully, I opened the secondary access restrictions tab. I created a temporary subholding pattern labeled escrow compliance freeze alpha and routed the full $2.4 million there. Legally, it was still in transit, but in reality, it was trapped in a digital oubliette only Henry and I could free. No one else could touch it without a complete audit log and both original signatories signing off in real time. And since Henry hadn't logged into the system in 11 months, the odds were in my favor. I initiated the transfer. Final screen, confirm and lock. I clicked yes. Just like that, the air shifted, like I'd crossed some invisible threshold between restraint and retribution. Outside my window, the delivery dock rumbled with forklifts. Phones buzzed. Life continued, oblivious. But inside that room, inside me, the pressure dropped. I was no longer hoping Chad would trip. I'd laid the wire. I'd turned off the safety. Now I just had to wait for him to dance. He called it a transparency alignment session, which was Chad speak for public execution with PowerPoint. Every department head was summoned. Even people who hadn't spoken aloud since pre-pandemic got an invite. The meeting room looked like a corporate jury box, row after row of exhausted professionals who knew damn well what this was about but were too scared or too bored to care. At the front stood Chad, sleeves rolled like he'd lifted anything heavier than a kombucha bottle in his life. Beside him, a 70-inch screen showing a giant red bar labeled Supplier Holdback's Legacy Funds. Below it, my name, Claire Halstead, like a criminal indictment. "Thanks for joining, everyone," he began, fake casual. "I want to take a moment to address something that's been stalling our momentum." He clicked and the next slide showed a graphic of an hourglass bleeding money. "Subtle. Some of you may be aware," he said, pacing, "that certain funds, vital funds, have not been released for campaign execution, despite legal approval, despite vendor green lights, despite strategic necessity." He turned toward me. "And the reason is sitting right here." Heads turned like dominoes. Didn't flinch. "Claire Halstead," he said, voice dipped in performative disappointment, "has unilaterally obstructed a high-level strategic initiative by refusing to authorize the release of escrowed funds. Funds that we agreed would be reallocated for growth." No one moved. Chad smiled, feigned sympathy. "Claire, maybe you can help us understand. Why are you holding this company back?" I slowly closed my notebook. Let the silence stretch until even the air felt awkward. "You mean the funds that require dual signature under a still active clause signed by your father?" I asked, sweet as arsenic. "Those funds?" His eyes flickered. Brief. Then the smirk returned. "We all know you have that power. But this isn't 2009. The company's evolving, Claire. You can't keep treating escrow like your personal panic button. This is a team now. You don't get to gatekeep innovation." A few nods from interns. Kellen beamed like a golden retriever who'd just found a dead squirrel. "And I'm sure," Chad added, stepping forward, "that if you care about this company's future, you'll do what's right. You'll authorize the release. Right now, in front of your team, I stood, not angrily, not defiantly, just stood. The room froze. Even Brittany, the brand advisor, stopped tapping on her iPad. Chad tilted his head. Claire, sit down and be grateful. Grateful. 14 years. 14 years of shielding this place from its own incompetence. From late-night supplier calls, from tax audits, from internal fraud, from him. I met his eyes and said one line. I've done enough sitting. Then I turned my laptop, already logged into the escrow portal, hovered my cursor over the Manage Signature tab. One last look around the room. No one breathed. And with one subtle, silent keystroke, I clicked Withdraw Authorization. The screen flashed. Status escrow frozen, one signature missing. Chad blinked. What did you just? I turned the laptop so he could see the system message. Transfer invalidated. Authorization incomplete. Funds locked pending original signatories. Someone in the back stifled a gasp. Kellen made a sound like a deflating beanbag. Chad's voice rose like a kicked wasp. Claire, are you out of your mind? You just tanked the campaign. You're going to cost us the supplier. No, Chad. I said calmly, you did that. I just stopped you from stealing the match before you set the house on fire. He lunged toward my laptop. I closed it, gently like lowering the lid on a casket. The room remained silent. Chad stood trembling, lips moving but no sound coming out. I turned to the rest of the room. If anyone wants to understand what just happened, check the contracts. Escrow clause. Dated 2016. Signed by Henry Blakemore and me. Then I picked up my notebook, tucked it under my arm, and walked toward the door. Behind me, Chad finally croaked out a sentence. Dad's gonna hear about this. I didn't look back. Just smiled. Good, he should. The room didn't erupt. It curdled like milk left too long in the summer sun. Chad stood frozen in front of the blank projector screen, mouth ajar, pupils twitching like a man trying to reboot his internal software. He looked less like a leader and more like a frat boy who just realized his trust fund didn't cover criminal negligence. Phones started buzzing. First one, then another, then all at once like a swarm of electronic hornets. The Cold Trail supplier was calling, repeatedly, their transport coordinator, their legal rep, their CFO. Operations pinged the freight channel. Why are loads on hold? Finance pinged back. Why is escrow locked? Chad stared down at his phone like it had personally betrayed him. Then looked to me, that twitchy upper lip of his starting to curl. You can't do this, he hissed. This affects real-time logistics. I didn't bother answering. Just packed my laptop with unhurried grace and snapped my briefcase shut with a click loud enough to silence 3 simultaneous side conversations. Then the door opened, and in walked Henry Blakemore. Gray suit, leather shoes, and an expression carved from 70 years of being the most feared man in 5 states of warehousing. He walked in like he still owned every corner of the room because technically he did. People stood instinctively. Chad didn't. Henry took one look at the projected blank screen, another at his son, and finally landed on me. What's going on? He asked, voice low, calm, dangerous. Chad tried to answer, but his tongue tripped over his ego. She just sabotaged the supplier funds. She froze escrow, without warning. Now Cold Trail's holding everything, Dad, everything. Henry's eyes narrowed. Escrow? Chad gestured wildly toward me. She's been blocking the release. We had a campaign. Legal signed off. She's using some legacy clause like it gives her veto power over strategy. It's ridiculous. Henry turned to me. I didn't speak. Just reached into my briefcase and pulled out a slim black folder. Paper clipped, highlighted, and still bearing the original ink signatures. I walked to the center of the table and laid it in front of Henry. Page 9, I said. Section 14C. Escrow contingency authorization. Your signature. Mine, joint release protocol. Initiated 2016. Still active, never revoked. Henry flipped, found the clause instantly. His eyes scanned like a banker reviewing a foreclosure, calm, methodical, cold. He closed the folder. Why now? He asked me. I met his gaze, voice steady. Because your son tried to convert supplier protections into a marketing budget. Because he replaced audit chains with interns who can't spell vendor. Because he tried to weaponize my silence. Chad sputtered. It was a reallocation. You told me to lead. Henry didn't even look at him. The room was dead quiet now. Even Brittany had stopped tick-toking whatever trauma she thought she could spin into hash girl boss content. I've been patient, I told Henry. I stayed when he fired my team. I stayed when he humiliated me. I stayed when he assigned a cupcake influencer to shadow budget approvals. But this would have sunk us. Henry picked up the folder, held it like something sacred or dangerous. Chad finally broke. Dad, what did she just do? Henry turned to his son and answered the way only a man built from railroads, steel, and quarterly bloodletting could. She reminded you this isn't a toy. Chad stepped back like the words physically hit him. Henry turned to me again. Are the funds recoverable? They were never moved, I said. They're in a locked subpattern, not a dime lost, but the supplier knows and they're not happy. Henry nodded once, then looked toward the door. That's when I knew. He wasn't asking me to explain. He was about to clean house. I gave him a single nod, then walked to my seat. Retrieved the one final item in my briefcase, a sealed envelope. I slid it across the table toward Chad, but spoke to Henry. In there are every document, timestamp, and fake sign-off used over the last 4 months, all verified, no opinions, just facts. I adjusted my coat, picked up my coffee, turned toward the exit. Henry's voice followed me. Claire. I paused in the doorway. Thank you. I didn't answer. Didn't need to. I'd already won. By Friday morning, Cold Trail was gone. Not just annoyed. Not just reevaluating the partnership. Gone. They pulled all active shipments, canceled Q4 commitments, and published a quiet but devastating statement to their client portal. Effective immediately, Cold Trail Logistics is ceasing operations with Blakemore Distribution due to contract breaches and internal instability. The board found out the same way the rest of us did, through the alert ping from Bloomberg's logistics feed. Phones didn't just ring, they howled. The COO tried to put a lid on it, but once compliance saw the approval forgeries May had buried in the red folder, the investigation launched before Chad could even fire off a group Slack. Half the legal team called out sick. HR went silent. Kellen cried in the elevator and blamed finance witchcraft. I didn't stick around for the unraveling. I had one last task. I walked into my office, the same storage-adjacent shoebox they demoted me to, where the walls smelled faintly of mildew and old toner, and sat down one final time. Opened my bottom drawer. Pulled out the gray folder labeled Claire H. Not if but when. Inside, every meeting log, every signature trail, every email where I'd raised concerns about Chad's recklessness and been ignored, patronized, or outright erased. The original escrow contract, signed in ballpoint by Henry Blakemore. Financial charts showing every misallocated dollar, every cooked approval, every buried warning. On top, my resignation letter. No melodrama, no threats, just one final sentence: you trusted the wrong heir. I printed 3 copies. One for the boardroom chair I used to sit in, one for legal, and one I left in the break room right between the kombucha tap and the Team Chad branded coffee mugs. Then I walked out. No farewell party, no speech. Just me, my coat, and a folder full of receipts walking past Brittany's desk as she tried to Google how to do corporate budgets. I passed Henry in the lobby. He didn't say a word, just held my eye for 3 long seconds like he was trying to measure the exact weight of his mistake. I didn't blink. Outside, the October wind slapped my face like it owed me back pay. I didn't care. I kept walking. Behind me, I heard the glass doors hiss closed. The building, Blakemore Tower, all smug concrete and glass, stood silent. But I knew the truth. It wasn't a building anymore. It was a collapse in progress. The vendors would scatter, the board would feed on itself, and Chad? He'd finally learned that charisma without competence is just a longer fuse on a bigger bomb. I didn't look back, not once. Because when you spend 14 years holding something together, you earn the right to be the one who lets it fall. You're the real MVPs of the office jungle. Thanks for watching. Smash that subscribe button, or the coffee pot might just forget your next brew.